Alright, hello everybody, and welcome back to World Civilizations. So, our lesson for today is actually going to be a rather short one. Today, we'll be talking about a really important figure named Mao Zedong, and talking about the birth of communism in China. So, our class period today is really going to be looking at how China is influenced by what happens in Russia during the Russian Revolution, and what's happening in China in the aftermath of what we've covered so far during the age of imperialism. So, if you would, title your notes for today, Communism in China. So, just to set the stage for where we're going to be heading today, it's really important to understand that by the 1900s, the early 1900s, China was ripe for revolution. Think about what's happened in China so far. During the age of imperialism, the Chinese were largely humiliated. Their land was carved up after the Opium Wars as all of the different Western European nations swept in and divided them into spheres of influence. Uprisings like the Boxer Rebellion, these movements that tried to force out foreigners, force out Christians, force out industrialists who wanted to reap a profit off of the Chinese, were largely unsuccessful. Some in China felt the time had come for China to change its ways, to industrialize, to westernize, to become more like the rest of the developed world. Still, at the same time, many Chinese favored their traditional values, Confucianism, and things like that, and they really didn't want to change as much. So now enter a brand new movement. By 1911, the Kuomintang, also oftentimes referred to as the KMT, became this national movement in China under the leadership of a man named Sun Yat-sen. And you can see his portrait over there to the left. He's oftentimes referred to as Dr. Sun, so if you're reading about this event in the future, you may see him written about that way as well. So in 1911, he launched a revolution to overthrow the Qing dynasty. Now don't forget, think back to the very beginning of our class, the Qing dynasty had been in power since 1644, so centuries of Qing rule had passed. Now don't forget, when citizens in China began to lose faith in the ruling dynasty, they were said to have lost the mandate of heaven, legitimacy to continue ruling. And as China was carved up into these spheres of influence and really lost their world power, many people argued the kings had lost this mandate of heaven. So Sun launched this revolution in 1911 and ultimately became the president of China. Eventually, though, the transition in power to the leadership of Sun Yat-sen was very rocky. China was eventually taken over by warlords, and really the country fell into a large state of chaos. So really the initial goals of the 1911 revolution, the mission to westernize China, really were largely unsuccessful. So now enter a really important figure who we'll be talking about a lot more during the early Cold War, but this is a perfect time to really introduce him to you, Mao Zedong. So, many in China really were not very happy with Sun Yat-sen's brand of westernization, of industrialization, trying to modernize China. Many were looking just over their border into Russia, and instead were favoring Vladimir Lenin's brand of communism, watching very closely as the Russian Revolution transitioned power away from the Tsar and his family and toward, they perceived, the people of Russia. So, communism in China was largely born out of communism in Russia. By 1921, the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, was formed. Mao Zedong was among its founders. So what I would like you to do is read this primary source document along with me. This is from Mao Zedong, written in 1927, about his views on revolution. He writes, "Revolution is not a dinner party. nor an essay, nor a painting, nor a piece of embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained, and magnanimous. A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. The force of the peasantry is like that of the raging wind and driving rain. It is rapidly increasing in violence. No force can stand in its way. The peasantry will tear apart all nets which bind it and hasten along the road to liberation. They will bury beneath them all forces of imperialism, militarism, corrupt officialdom, village bosses, and evil gentry. So take a look at these two analysis questions. Feel free to pause the video here and answer them in your notes. Question 1 asks, how does Mao Zedong characterize a revolution? Question number 2 asks, how does he theorize he can form a revolution in China? So let's go back for just one moment. Sorry. All right. So to take a look at this document, you'll see some echoes of what was argued originally by Karl Marx, right, the father of communism. Don't forget, under Marxian ideals, he essentially argued that communism would be the result of the lower class, right, rising up and overthrowing the bourgeoisie. That the proletariat, the commoners, the lower class would become so large that eventually they would overthrow the middle class, upper class, and what would be left would be communism. You'll notice too that Mao Zedong is very firm in what he says will be the road to revolution. Compare that now to what you saw in interwar India with Gandhi. Gandhi preached civil disobedience and peaceful protest. What Mao is arguing here is for a much more aggressive and violent push to achieve what the common people want. He says a revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence in which one class overthrows the other. He says that once one of these revolutions begins, no force can stand in its way. The peasantry will tear apart all nets that stop them on their road to liberation. So again, if you haven't answered these questions, feel free to pause and answer them now. So, transitioning forward, we're going to see a civil war erupt in China between two different groups. The nationalists, right, those who wanted to westernize China, make them more European-like, right, and those who supported communism. So the KMT, the Kuomintang, are the nationalists. The CCP, or the Chinese Communist Party, would be those in favor of communism. At first, both of these groups worked together to stop the warlords and get China under control. After Dr. Sun Yat-sen, died in 1925, Chiang Kai-shek, as you can see photographed over there to the left, became the leader of the KMT. Civil war broke out between him and Mao Zedong of the Chinese Communist Party. Ultimately, this is going to be our first look at capitalism versus communism. For a large part of our class, we're really going to be talking about these two different ideologies colliding with each other, most notably during the Cold War, but you'll see that depicted here very, very clearly. Interestingly, the history of China might look very different had the KMT actually succeeded. Between 1934 and 1935, the KMT really had the CCP on the ropes. They had forced the Red Army to the far corner of southern China. Under the leadership of Mao Zedong, though, the Red Army marched 9,000 kilometers in only 1 year. Only 1/10 of their troops survived this incredibly treacherous and long march, but the reason this is so important is that Mao Zedong really emerged as the clear voice, clear leader of the Communist Party, and you'll see that Chairman Mao is really going to shape the kind of country China becomes throughout our class under this communist regime. Just to show you on a map, this is what the Long March looks like. You can see that it's a long trek all the way around the central part of China, 9,000 kilometers. So just to wrap us up for today, in terms of the legacy of this, why this is important, this is where we'll see Mao Zedong really take control of China. By 1949, communists were really the main power in the Chinese mainland. Mao Zedong became chairman of the country, and China was officially renamed the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. So we're going to pause here today. You'll see during the Cold War, we'll be spending a lot more time really delving in to how China develops and how Chinese communism takes shape.